We'll just give people one more minute and then we will get started. All right, folks, I think we will get started. I might be continuously letting people in as the event starts, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited for this event. It is our first ever research launch. And so thank you for joining us on this Monday night. Just so you know, this meeting is being recorded. So if you do have to hop off halfway or you miss anything, please reach out and I can definitely send the recording over. So we're going to start off with some land acknowledgements. So at Amadeusz, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We'll also be doing an African ancestry acknowledgement. Amadeusz also acknowledges the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will and made to work on these lands. All right, so welcome everyone. I want to start just by introducing myself. A lot of you are familiar faces and names, so it's nice to see some students, some placement students, some past staff and current staff on the team, and for everyone else, welcome. My name is Kim Dacuna, so I am the Director of Programs and Services at Amadeusz. I'll be doing a little bit of the intros and moderating, and then also just taking a backseat and enjoying tonight. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about Amadeusz. Amadeusz is a charitable organization, and I'm really proud to say that because we just got charitable status earlier this summer. We've been operating since 2009, and we support young people who are incarcerated to create positive change in their lives through access to education, community supports, programs, and through exceptional care. We are so excited to have the opportunity to host this event. We're excited to have engaging conversations about research that we've been conducting, hopefully have a lot of question and answer period, and really reflect on our past, current, and future publications. So without any delay, let's get started. I'm going to actually introduce Amadeusz's research team. So we're going to get started with introducing Tina Nadia Gopal Chambers. So Tina Nadia is, I went ahead for a second. Tina Nadia is the founder of Amadeusz, and she has worked with children and youth in various settings for over 20 years. In addition to her work in the community, she also teaches at various post-secondary institutions. So thank you, Tina, for joining us. Next up, we have Dr. Ardavan Izadarad. Dr. Ardavan is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University. He's the author of Decolonizing Educational Assessment, Ontario Elementary Students, and the EQAO, and co-editor of Equity as Praxis in Early Childhood Education and Care, and International Handbook of Anti-Discriminatory Education. So it's lovely to have you, Dr. Ardavan. Finally, we have Sarah Woods. So Sarah Woods is actually our Director of Research and Program Evaluation at Amadeusz. Sarah is a doctoral candidate in Ontario Tech University's Criminology and Social Justice program, as well as the manager of SNAP Youth Justice Implementation at Child Development Institute. She has worked with children, youth, and adults in justice and mental health settings with significant work in implementation and program evaluation. Sarah's research interests include youth and juvenile justice, children's mental health, at-risk youth, criminal justice policy, and program implementation and evaluation. So we're really honored to have these three experts, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say tonight. So I'm actually going to pass it off to Tina Nadia first to take us through some of Amadeus's past publications.
Thank you, Kim. So we're gonna start by talking about some of Amadeus's past publications. The first publication we did was in 2014, and it was published through York University through the review of Canadian policy, social review of Canadian policy. And the title here is Look at My Life, Access to Education for the Remand Population in Ontario. The paper was written by Sarah Woods, myself, and also we were receiving mentorship at that time from Purnima George, who's an associate professor at Ryerson University. So this paper uses, talks about access to education for the remand population using a rights-based approach. If you read the paper, at the end of the paper, there are 10 recommendations for access to education for the remand population in Ontario. What we did is we launched a project called The Quiet Storm, where we had University of Toronto students examine the recommendations, and through consultation in community, they were able to create a strategy, which is called the Quiet Storm, that we are hoping to implement this strategy in order to, this strategy contains different activities that we would need to do in order to implement the recommendations found in this paper. So that is where this paper is at, and what we have been able to do with it. The next paper that we did was a research project that we launched in 2016. It was called Look at My Life, Sparks for Firearm Possession Among Young People in Toronto. We interviewed 10 young people that had multiple firearm charges. And through this project, we were able to produce the summary of the research findings, which you see here. And in addition to that, a full-length paper with the recommendations. From the recommendations from this research project, Amadeus launched Prosper, which is a service that Amadeus provides for young people that are ages 18 to 29 with firearm-related charges in Toronto. So Prosper provides intensive case management and peer support for these young people throughout incarceration and throughout their change in custodial status and as they are released back into the community. The next paper that we did was published in 2018. And this paper was published through Windsor University through Critical Social Work. And this paper, again, was written by Sarah Woods, myself, and Purnima George, responding to neoliberalism, the case of the Look at My Life project. Through this paper, we spoke about our education program at Amadeus, which is formerly known as the Look at My Life project. And we spoke about the impact of neoliberalism on the project, highlighting ways in which resistance can still be carried out within current neoliberal practices, policies, and institutional culture that may prevent access to education for young people on remand. So now I'm going to pass it on to Sarah Woods to talk about what we are currently working on.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about a paper that we're currently working on. It's called Look at My Life, Emotional Implications of Qualitative Research. So it's based off of the interviews that Tina conducted for the Sparks firearm study that she did. And it's really looking at, we often talk about the vulnerability of our research participants, so the people that we're interviewing or studying, which is very, very important. But we don't often think about the vulnerability of the researcher. And so this paper looks at sensitive research, which is defined as really anything that has an emotional impact on the researcher. So in this case, there was sort of a commonality between the researchers who conducted the work and the participants, and it was based on a sensitive topic, gun possession. So what does that mean for the researcher who's engaging in this type of work? And so looking at emotional vulnerability is really important because we know it can have significant impacts while the research is going on, as well as post-research. And then how does that emotional vulnerability of the researcher play into the dynamic between researcher and participant? So how does that impact the unfolding of the research project? So then the second piece to this is we know that as, and I should have said, it's from a practitioner researcher perspective. So practitioner researchers are individuals that do both practice work, so they're social workers or they're therapists, but they also do researchers, and they have a unique perspective because they have both those therapeutic skills as well as the researcher skills. And we often use, rapport building strategies to gain trust with our participants and our clients. So bringing this all together, how does that, rapport building strategy, sharing parts of yourself to create that commonality between you and the participant, if that's based on a sensitive topic, what does that do for the researcher? How does that impact the vulnerability of the researcher? And the paper is going to conclude with some recommendations around, as researchers, what can we do to maintain our own mental health, our own self-care, while still engaging in really important research topics?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Next, Dr. Ardevan Izadarad will be speaking about our most recent publication. Go ahead, Ardevan.
Great, thank you. Well, this one is relatively hot off the press. It just came out a couple months ago, and it was published in the Journal of Law and Social Policy, which is housed at York University Osgood Law School. And basically, the paper is about the experiences Amadeus have had based on the participants who've accessed their programs and services, particularly around the record suspension program, which theoretically is meant to give people a second chance. But what we've argued is we've actually found the current way the record suspension program is being enacted and implemented, it's still inequitable. And we identified some of these systemic barriers. One of them is a high monetary cost for an application, which applying does not necessarily guarantee you are granted a record suspension, costing around $670 approximately. The long waiting period of 5 to 10 years to even apply for the record suspension. We know from the time you're released, particularly when you reintegrate back in the community, those can be difficult times. And if you cannot find employment to sustain yourself, it can further expose you to risk factors affiliated with involvement to violence. And the last piece was we've identified as a systemic barrier based on the case studies of Amadeus participants was the parole board considering non-conviction dispositions, meaning they're allowed to look at police notes even if you were acquitted of charges. And this can also lead to denying your record suspension program. So we took 3 specific case studies, once again, people who have accessed Amadeus programs and services. And we made a case that some things need to be changed because currently the program is actually perpetuating the systemic barriers, even though theoretically it's intended to help people reintegrate back into the community. So some of the recommendations we make towards the end of the paper is the parole board should not take into consideration any prior acquitted or withdrawn charges when they are evaluating record suspension program. The waiting period for record suspension should be reduced. And the requirement for an application fee should be dropped fully because you now have to raise $650 to maybe get a record suspension. This should automatically kick in if you've served the time period. as well as more funding needs to be invested by the federal and provincial and territorial governments to support intensive case management of the people who are charged with a crime and are in remand. And mentorship should be a key initiative in helping people be resilient when dealing with stressors and transition. So mentorship opportunities should really be built into intensive case management, particularly during that transition from when you are released out of custody back into the community, because it could be a high stressful time. So I'll leave it at that. Hopefully this is enough for you to go out and read it. It's not a long read, and it's available on the Amadeus research tab on their website.
Thank you, Ardavan. Next, Ardavan will be speaking about our current research project with ONCAT, the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer.
Great. So this one is not on the website yet, so I'm going to put a link in the chat. It's a longer read because it did a whole literature review. There's kind of phase 1 and phase 2 funded by ONCAT, which is great. In phase 1, we were looking to do a literature review on access to education for the remand and incarcerated population in Ontario. And really, if you're not familiar with the term remand, it's pretrial detention, meaning you're charged with a crime. At this stage, you're not guilty or not guilty, but you're awaiting perhaps your trial date, whether on bail or not, right? So the idea behind the literature review was to really see in a Canadian context, what are the numbers and what can we learn? And then to build on it into phase 2. So what we found in the literature review, that there's a rise in remand population. Remand population now outnumbers the sentenced offenders federally as well as provincially in Canada. And that tells us that there's some systemic things going on there. So what do we need to do? I think access to education was not a priority. And I think this is where Amadeus is doing a lot of advocacy and activism to bring awareness to this issue. And the literature review found that really the main 2 organizations doing this kind of work are Amadeus and Walls to Bridges. And in terms of the specifics, there needs to be more investments in really making information accessible, because it took compiling quite a few resources to come up with these findings. They're all in different reports. Some are shelved, some are online. So really we need a one-stop shop where all this information is accessible. So imagine how someone feels just being released, who cannot access this information. Even us as researchers, we're having problems accessing the information. So that tells you that we need to make this information more available, and education needs to be more of a priority because it's such a key protective factor in preventing recidivism and getting involved with risk factors affiliated with crime and violence. So if we invest in education in the long term, we're actually going to save money, because I just want to give you one stat. It costs Correctional Service Canada an average of $111,000 annually to incarcerate one man, and twice as much to incarcerate one woman. With only about $3,000 that money spent on education per prisoner. And so in the long run, if we invest more money on education, we don't even have to spend as much money in incarceration. So that was phase 1. There's a lot more there. There's a shorter executive summary to check out and a longer report that also gives you some programs that are in the States that perhaps we can take some things and learn from it. In phase 2, we're now in phase 2. We've basically taken a literature and we've interviewed 10 Amadeus participants who actually have access to educational programs or the case management services. And we want to see where does their lived experience align with the larger themes in the literature. We've also interviewed 10 representatives from different post-secondary institutions to see where do they stand in terms of creating perhaps or being involved with a pilot project that offers education to those who are incarcerated and are a remand population. So we're at the stage of, Tina has just wrapped up a lot of interviews, and we're going to be initiating the data analysis soon. And the long-term goal of this project is to actually create that pilot project and make it happen with post-secondary institutions. And if that goes well, hopefully build off of it and make it larger so it becomes something permanent and it's not pilot, that prioritizes access to education to those facing difficulties and being in the remand.
Yeah. Thank you, Ardavan. Yeah, in addition to the interviews that Ardavan spoke about, I also did 2 more interviews with the institutions in which Amadeusz works in. And yes, as Ardavan said, we look forward towards now the data analysis phase of those 25 interviews in order to look at the credit transfer experience of the remand population in regards to post-secondary schooling, and looking at, developing a specific pathway that can be implemented at various post-secondary institutions as a pilot to support those young people. Thank you, Ardavan.
So at this time, I wanted to pass it off to anyone who's attending today's event. I have been looking at the chat, and I don't see any questions in the chat box, but I wanted to know if anyone did want to unmute their mic. I know we have some students here, some academics, some people working in the field. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put it in the chat box or unmute yourself to ask our research team at this time. And maybe I'll get started for a question for the research team as people are sort of pondering what they can ask. So I wanted to know, since starting Amadeusz work, what changes in education have you noticed in terms of access to education for remand population?
Sorry, Kim, did someone ask that question?
I'm asking it.
Oh, sorry,
Just to get people as they're thinking, I'll repeat it one more time. So for all 3 of you on the research team, since you've sort of, been doing Amadeusz research at different times, I wanted to know from each of you, since starting your work with Amadeusz, what changes in education have you noticed in terms of access to education for the remand population?
Well, I know that for myself personally, and then I could pass it on to Sarah and Ardavan, I've personally seen significant changes in access to education for the remand population in Ontario since the start of Amadeusz's education program in 2009. An example of this would be, we weren't allowed to, for example, have hardcover books or large books. The GED book is over 900 pages. So we weren't allowed to have those books brought into the inside. But now today, the GED book has been approved. Other tools that would have not been approved before have been approved. And these are things that people need in order to access education and be successful at it and be able to, do their work, do an exam, do their essay, or, write an exam. So even just at the beginning of the program in 2009, having the director then, Wayana Trevis, having her, organize the first exam, for example, and having to navigate and negotiate the policies at that time and the current daily procedures at that time, the institutional procedures in order to have that exam occur, those sorts of things, So I've seen significant change on the part of the institution in regards to giving, third parties access to the institution in order to provide access to education. I don't know if you would like to add anything, Sarah or Ardavan?
Yeah, I think you touched a little bit on sort of the institution perspective, and that's what I was going to talk about. I think when we first started, there was a lot of resistance to our programming, and, people who worked on the inside didn't see the need for our programming, didn't think people were worth giving this programming to. And I think one of the big successes, don't get me wrong, some of that attitude is definitely still there, but I think some of our biggest successes is seeing some of those attitude shifts change and seeing staff on the inside really value the program and value giving education for the participants on the inside. And that really helps, create a culture of education and acceptance. And I think that helps the participants succeed as well when,
Yeah.
some of the people who work on the inside are supporting them as well. So it's not just us. They get it from their peers. They get it from some other staff as well. So I think that's something that I've noticed has changed. I think on the negative side, if you had asked me, I guess it's 13 years ago now, if there would be other programs doing this work, I probably would have said yes. And so I think a part of me is still surprised that we're, one of the only organizations doing this work for this particular population. And I think that just sort of speaks to this group as kind of the forgotten group, and lost opportunities for, enhancing skills and providing those supports for when they do come back on the outside. So definitely some successes that we've seen, but also still some continued need and challenges going on. Ardavan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think just to echo that, I think, the reality is most people incarcerated, whether on remand or sentenced based on the statistics, have less than a high school education. But I think that doesn't mean that this should be forgotten, as Sarah has mentioned, that we want to continue to create pathways into post-secondary, because education is such a key factor in opening upward doors for upward social mobility, and for them to sustain themselves and not get caught in a cycle of poverty and violence. And I think to the other point is the most programs, and that's also the negative, is systemic barriers. A lot of things that do exist with post-secondary partnerships and the work we do is paper-based correspondence, and that can slow things down from giving someone feedback about their learning to really how long it takes to get things done and really be engaged. So I think investing in technology and just making it accessible is one way that hopefully, COVID really, I think, centered some of these issues, but hopefully it's able to progress faster to allow the education component to become more accessible and reach the people who really need it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you. Those were really insightful responses. And I can also say for myself, just like starting to work with Amadeus about 5 years ago to now, the growth and the shifting that's happened has been amazing. But also it's like, but we still have so far to go. And I know last year itself, we were able to have like the first graduation ceremony at one of the institutions. And this year we've already had 2 more since that. And so I'm slowly seeing things shifting, but I agree with all of you that there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. So I have another question that was messaged to me directly from one of our attendees. So maybe this is more for Sarah and Tina. What are some of the successes and challenges of conducting research with the remand population?
Sorry, Kim, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I'll say it one more time. What are some of the successes and challenges of conducting research with the remand population?
Okay. I know from my personal experience, there's been a lot of challenges and those challenges you can't overcome. You just have to deal with them and try and figure it out. Some of those challenges have been length of time for phone calls. So for example, if I'm on the phone with someone and I'm trying to do an interview with them, maybe the phone call length is not long enough because they're on the inside. So maybe, we have to revise our questions and make sure that, we don't ask too many questions to ensure that we have enough time to speak to the person and get the exact data that is most important. So that's been a huge challenge. Also, some other challenges. I think just like generally, like as I already said, I just gave the example of the length of the phone call. I think just generally, just remembering that it is a jail first, and that any work that we may be doing, program evaluation, pre-post surveys, any data collection that we are doing. We just have to be mindful of the institutional policies and procedures, and just remembering that it is a jail first, and that we have to respect and follow those and navigate them in order to make sure that we're able to get the data that we need to do the work that we need to do. Sarah, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was going to add something similar to what you were just talking about there in terms of working with a correctional population, as the literature likes to call it. The environment that we're in, always remembering, as Tina said, that it's a custody facility, and safety and security is for people on the working on the inside. That's their primary responsibility, and sometimes the values of research and practices of research can come up against some of those institutional policies. So navigating our way through them to make sure we're, honoring participant confidentiality and respect, et cetera, while working within that particular environment. And sort of coming from that, tying back to the paper that I was talking about in terms of emotional vulnerability, this is kind of where that idea for the paper came from, in that anytime you're talking to people on the inside, you're most likely hearing very difficult stories, whether it's the reasons they've come to be on the inside, being separated from their family, just the whole idea of having your freedom taken away from you. So the spaces that these people are in, sort of more mentally, and the stories that they share can be very challenging to hear. And so, similar to other researchers who work within sensitive research, but just being mindful of, some of the conversations and topics that you'll be engaging with, and how that can impact us in the broader work that we do. So those are some of the challenges for sure in terms of conducting research, but some of the successes, you asked about both successes and challenges, right, Kim? Yeah. So some of the successes, I think, while they are difficult conversations, some of the conversations we've had with participants have been fantastic. I've learned so much from them, appreciate their willingness to share their stories with us, so that we can learn and we can share their stories with others, so we can learn about the broader systemic challenges that are happening. So I think there's some really, great learning for me personally, as well as our team, and just the strength and openness of some of the people that we've talked to has been really rewarding in the work that we do. Tina, did you have any successes that you can think of to share?
I agree with everything you just said. I would say the same thing. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, we have a few more questions flowing in, so I want to keep going. Thank you both so much. So the next question is for Dr. Ardavan. What are sort of your ultimate project goals for the ONCAT research that you're doing?
I think, as mentioned, I think the goal is eventually, which aligns with Amadeusz' mandate and values, is to make education more accessible for the remand population. And that means really just literally help to create those pathways, whether it's getting your GED, but then ongoing to post-secondary education. So the idea of the pilot project would be that eventually a couple of the institutions will come together. They were willing to, based on whatever they can, allocate some resources and funding to see how it would go, working with a small population, making post-secondary more accessible, and then learn from those. Whenever you have a pilot project, it's not going to be perfect. There'll be some hurdles and challenges along the way as teachable moments, and to address those and continue to make something that is permanent. It's not a pilot project. I think if we can, eventually get some more government support at the federal level, where there are scholarships for those who are incarcerated to actually do educational programs, something that on and off has existed in the United States based on what party is in power. And so I think these are some of the long-term goals that can lead to the culture shift, where people who are incarcerated stop being seen from a deficit lens, as being blamed for being incarcerated. We know There's a lot of systemic issues from racial profiling, from intersection of poverty and racism that lead to many people being incarcerated. And I think we have to address the root causes of those issues. And I think Amadeus in all its programs and services and publication is trying to advocate for that in different ways, to bring numerous partnerships and partners and different community organizations to build on that.
Yeah, thanks, Doctor. That's really powerful, like people being seen from the deficit lens, and I do agree. So I hope that in our lifetime we get to see that shift. We have another question from an attendee. So it's a bit of a long one. Feel free for anyone to jump in. The question is, in my work with low-income communities, I often get people telling me low-income populations don't often fight hard enough for themselves. Now, this is not my personal belief, but I guess this is those people's experience. And with that being said, I know that the Amadeus mission is overall great, but do you ever find it hard to reach this population? And if so, how do you navigate this?
Kim, I think it would be really good for you to answer that question as the Director of Programs and Services, because you have a lot of experience working directly with the population.
Yeah, when I read it, I was like, oh man, but I know that people do hold these beliefs, which is like, it gets us, because when we're the ones, doing the work. I think that this is common and people do think this, and it's really hard to hear, especially coming from someone who works on the front lines and works with like amazing students and can hear their stories and knows like how brilliant they are. It's really tough. What I will say, yeah, sometimes it's hard to reach people. I think whenever you're working with a vulnerable population, you need to understand that there's a lot of circumstances in their life that make them vulnerable. And it's not as easy for them to just, come outside when they get out and be like, okay, I'm ready to like do my GED or get into a college course. Sometimes they have to, get their ID, like figure out where they're living. Do they have money for groceries? If they're out on bail, like sometimes they have to pay for an ankle monitor. Like there are so many barriers. And I think people often disregard everything else that's being thrown at them. And this is perceived as they're not trying hard enough or they're not fighting for themselves. But I think in reality, when you talk to people, you really hear the struggles that they face because of how many barriers they have one after the other when they come out or even while they're inside. And so that is sort of from my own experience, like, yes, it is hard to reach some of them. That has been my experience. But I think when you do the work long enough, you can also understand why that is the case. And I think if you keep showing up and you're consistent and they know that you do genuinely care about them, that's where you see the biggest difference and the shift, and you will sort of get through to them because they do really appreciate it, but you have to meet people where they're at.
I think I just want to quickly add on to that, Kim. That was well said. I think, that's ideas like that are one of the main reasons we so strongly emphasize the research at Amadeus, because we're working to sort of dispel some of those stereotypes by advocating and creating awareness about this particular population in terms of, the systemic challenges and barriers that are really up against them. I think Ardavan touched on them as the criminal record. Sorry, I don't know the proper term right there, but this record suspension pieces and all the barriers. That's a good case example of it's not just as easy as getting rid of your record. There's a lot of things going on. And so I think that's, a main goal of our research is to try to get our publications out there and create some awareness and knowledge around this population and some of the systemic issues that they're facing.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you, Sarah. So we have another question, and this again can be answered by any of you. How do you ensure that the voices of individuals who are incarcerated are centered within your research? I'll read that one more time. How do you ensure that the voices of individuals who are incarcerated are centered within your research?
I can jump in to start. I think at the end of the day, whenever you do research, particularly qualitative research, which is what we're doing, I think it's all about trust. particularly when you're working with marginalized populations, or such as those incarcerated. And I think, for example, in our case, we're working with people who already have a connection with Amadeus, who've gone through the programs and services, whether it was purely positive or some hiccups along the way due to challenges. And I think the whole point is not to kind of present this sanitized, here's the perfect solution, but it's what is working, what are the challenges, and how can we as a collective work towards that. And I think there's other pieces where, of course, we try to be ethical, using anonymity to maintain confidentiality, and that's important because in some cases there's still ongoing charges and they have to still be in front of court. So I think we use kind of all these, but I think when it comes to trust and relationship building, it's one thing, and that was a really great question. It's one thing to include someone in research, but it's another thing to center it, to go back to them and say, hey, this is how we're interpreting it. Do you agree or disagree? Did we misinterpret it? And I think that's all part of the relationship building, and to make sure the research is authentic. So we're not speaking on behalf of others, which often happens in the field of equity, and making those voices are authentic and speaking based on their own lived experiences, which can have multiple interpretations.
Yeah, that was really well said. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
and I'll
much.
just add to that, working with this population, because they're on the inside, sometimes it can be really challenging to include them in opportunities. But I know in the past, we've had past participants attend conferences with us, or speak on panels, or they've been involved in not promotional material, but interviews with other organizations or media. So we try to provide those opportunities for our participants where possible. And that's really where the centering the youth in the research comes in. As Ardavan said, allowing them to speak and share their own stories rather than us being the face. But as we continuously say, we need to be very careful of confidentiality. And, a lot of participants don't want to acknowledge that they've been in custody before, for all of the reasons that we've talked about previously. So we've tried our best, and we can certainly continue to work on that. And it's a good question to remind us to keep doing that.
Yeah. Thank you so
And
much,
I think
Sarah.
quickly on top of that is also like making the information accessible, because we recognize not everyone is going to be able to download and read journal articles. So for example, the Amadeus podcast, I think is a great way where a lot of these big ideas and discussions are taken up by people who have experiences of being incarcerated. And I put the link in the chat. It's a great way to listen from a different vantage point coming into this space. But I think the research is also important in the sense that it legitimizes what Amadeus is doing. It allows us, the organization, to create opportunities for more funders and agencies to come on board. So I think we're kind of doing the advocacy along the different lines and vantage points. And the more that we do, the more we're able to amplify the message and the importance of this topic and area as a priority.
Yeah, that's so true. And I like the plug for Off the Record. Available on all streaming platforms. Okay, we have one final question, and then we'll see if anything else comes up. So this question is, why is the focus of sort of Amadeus work and research on the remand population?
So when Amadeus first started back in 2009, we wanted to launch the Look at My Life project, which is our education program. It was formerly known as that. And at that time, there was no access to education for the remand population. There was only access for people that were convicted 2 years plus a day and were residing in federal institutions. And so that's why we had a focus on the remand population. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that. So it's, in our first paper, I believe, we go through it a little bit more. So if you're interested, you can look at some of those stats. But in federal 2 years plus a day custody, as Tina mentioned, it's actually mandated that all individuals have an educational assessment, and they're supposed to be taking educational courses if they are below a certain level. There was nothing like that at the remand provincial level. So that's where the big gap in services was. And then, as Tina said, no organizations actually offering those pieces. And then, as I think it was Tina or Artevin, sorry, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, the remand population is actually now bigger than the correctional population. So those who are still legally innocent, awaiting further court appearance, is a bigger population than those who have been convicted guilty of a charge. So in terms of needs, the population was greater on that side. So those are just some particular reasons, quite a gap in service that we noted and we continue to note, as we mentioned earlier.
And I think what Sarah said too earlier is that still to this day, Amadeus is one of the only organizations doing this work for this population. So there's still a need, right, that we're servicing, but the need is great. Yeah. Tina, were you going to add something? We do have one more question in the chat.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, so this question is, how is the research given back to the population?
I personally, oh, sorry. From my perspective, I think that the research has given so much back, not only to the population, but to community, to society, because there was a lack of like Canadian-based research in this area. And so I think that having exposed certain topics and certain inequities that people face that are incarcerated in Ontario has really allowed us to move forward and provide more programs and more services and really focus on, you know, the inequitable access to education and community supports and, you know, work towards navigating and negotiating those things to make, you know, these things possible for the remand population.
Tina, sorry, I think the person rephrased it. I think they meant, so they typed again, how do they know, so how do the participants know the results of the research, like in that sense, given back? How do they know the results of the research?
Yeah, well, we disseminate like the research with the participants, and we also share any sort of publications that are finalized, as Artevin was talking about, you know, going back to make sure that the story was accurate and the interpretation was accurate and so on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Artevin, did you have anything to add to that? Or are you just unmuted?
No, I think for us, research is advocacy. It's not like an add-on. What we write and how we write and where we present it, all of this are very intentional. And you know, in our world, research is a form of advocacy itself. And I think you know, I myself have to remind people, even when you're reading this, you know, it's not just statistics. Every one of those stats represents a number, represents a person with feelings, with emotions, who's impacted by gun violence, poverty. You know, we know people who've gone in and we've lost them over the years. So we are also impacted, and we come into this space having been impacted by these systemic issues. I mean, we're privileged not to be incarcerated, but I think many of us could have been if we didn't have some of those access to some of those support systems. So I think we remind that, and that's kind of the driving force behind what we do. And it's not all pretty and butterflies. It's an uphill battle. So I think we kind of find some healing amongst each other and coming together with like-minded people who are passionate to advocate for these issues. And I think that's important, because sometimes we have to self-care and regroup and keep it going. And I think the best indicator is that Amadeus is still going and growing. And if it was not effective, we wouldn't be here, and it wouldn't be an ongoing, growing, you know, agency and organizations. And I think a lot of people have done a lot of heavy lifting, and it's a small organization, but it has made a difference. Even if it's a difference in one person's life, that's a world of difference to that person who is incarcerated, if you know someone who's been in jail and in and out. So I think the numbers are there, but it's more than that. And I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves when we're engaged in research and doing research, it's not just numbers, we're dealing with people.
Wow, thank you, Arvin. I like that, going and growing, which is really true. I appreciate all of you so much, and I could feel like I could just listen to you guys talk about this forever. But we are hitting that 1 hour mark, and so I just wanted to say a big thank you to our research team, Sarah, Tina, and Arvin, for just sharing your thoughts, your reflections, really insightful conversations. Thank you to our attendees. Those questions were remarkable, and I feel like we did have really thoughtful discussions. I will shamelessly now plug all our social media. Artemin, thank you so much for plugging our podcast and our sweaters. We do have some limited time merch, so he did send the links for that. Please, folks, check it out. If you are interested in sort of following us in our journey, we are quite active on social media. So we do have a Twitter, a Facebook, and an Instagram. If you have any inquiries, questions, remarks, thoughts, you can email us at info@amadeus.ca. But please feel free to reach out. We're always looking to kind of, make our community bigger. And I'm really thankful for everyone attending tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.